we've had some great insights into the hidden complexities of AI and where people need to shift their focus and their efforts to make sure you get the 20% transformation right. So at this point, I want to bring up Amy Nordrum, who will take us to the edge.
And hello again. We have a fabulous lineup of speakers for you this afternoon, so let's dive right in. In this session, we're going to focus on one particular part of the computing ecosystem where AI is making some big moves, and that is at the edge. Now, I know most of you are familiar with this term, but for anyone who's not, the edge refers to the devices on the edge of a network that are closest to a source of data, whether that's a person or a machine or something else you're trying to measure. So depending on the situation, the edge could be a remote sensor stuck somewhere out in the wilderness, or your smartphone, or a self-driving car. There are a few things pushing companies to try and do more at the edge. One is the explosion of data and the need to process massive amounts of data very quickly. Rather than upload all of that data to the cloud, it can be cheaper and faster to do more of this at the edge. Another is advances in computing, including new chips that have made it possible to put more processing power at the edge. And a third factor is, of course, the advent of AI, which is helping edge devices become more intelligent and efficient. Of course, as we heard earlier today, there's no doubt the cloud will continue to grow and integrate more AI as well, but not everything can or should be done in the cloud. So what decisions and actions belong at the edge and which definitely do not? What happens when edge devices become more intelligent? And how can AI be used appropriately to harness all of this potential? Our speakers today come from very different vantage points across the industry. Later, we'll hear from someone who's leading AI development for a major consumer product that's probably in many of your homes today. I know I have one. And just one quick note, Raquel Erdison, who is going to join us from the company Wabi for this segment, was not able to make it at the last minute, so we'll get some bonus time for our first two speakers. Up first, we have Sheldon Fernandez, the CEO of Darwinai. His company, which is based in Waterloo, Canada, specializes in using AI to do visual inspections for quality control in manufacturing. And they pride themselves on being able to explain why their AI is making the decisions it does, which they say both increases trust with their clients and improves their AI's overall performance. Sheldon comes to Darwinai from a multidisciplinary background that includes studies in creative writing, human rights, and theology, as well as computer engineering. Sheldon will share a short presentation to kick us off, and then I'll join him back on stage to ask my questions as well as yours. So let's get started. Sheldon, welcome to EmTech Digital.
All right, thank you very much. Hi, everybody. My name is Sheldon Fernandez, and I'm the CEO of Darwinai. And I'm really excited about today's topic, which is an interesting one, explainability at the edge. But I'm also excited because this is the first time in 2 years that I've been outside the country of Canada. I landed in Boston yesterday, and I got a text message on my phone that said, "Welcome to the United States, roaming charges apply." And there was an identical message from the same number from Rogers Communication right above it, dated February 26, 2020. And so I took a screenshot of it because it really does encapsulate what the last 2 years have been for many of us, and I apologize for bringing the warm Canadian winter to Massachusetts here. But just by way of background, Darwinai is a 5-year-old artificial intelligence company based out of Ontario, Canada, and our mission is to transform industries by instilling trust in artificial intelligence. And a key element of instilling that trust is illuminating the black box of artificial intelligence, which many of you will have heard about, and which is the focus of today's talk. Now, we are organically connected to the University of Waterloo, which is kind of like the MIT of Canada. We like to think of ourselves as the doppelganger to the north. And one of the great joys of my job is that I really get to work with world-class talent, including Professor Alexander Wong, who's our chief scientist and is also Canada's research chair in artificial intelligence, and was recently named as one of the top 2% scientists in the world. So it really is a pleasure to just work with minds such as this. Now, our team has been working with foundational artificial intelligence for about a dozen years. So well before many of us would have encountered terms like deep learning and machine learning and data bias, our team as academics were refining and enhancing the core fundamental technology that is really the topic of this entire conference. And one of the areas that we've gone quite deep in is the topic of explainable AI. Now, many of you are familiar with this phenomenon, but just quickly to review this, the challenge with deep learning and machine learning systems is that they learn by looking at hundreds of thousands, if not millions of examples of data, and then deducing patterns in that data that really is not accessible to us and giving us predictive and correlative insights on that data that are very meaningful. The challenge from an operational perspective is that even the experts that design these systems have very little understanding as to how they reach their decisions. Now, when we started talking about this as a company in 2018, it was more an intellectual curiosity than a real problem that we were grappling with as an industry. Because back then, we were too worried about getting data and operationalizing AI as opposed to actually grappling with this problem of explainability. But if we fast forward to today, you'll see that a lot of the weighty topics that we talk about, ethical AI, governance, fairness, robustness, all involve explainability in some central way. In fact, I would contend that explainability is a necessary, if insufficient, precursor to many of those topics. Now, a very amusing example I can give you of explainability actually occurred in the second year of Darwinai. We were working with an autonomous vehicle client that ran into a very strange situation where their car would turn left with increasing statistical frequency when the color of the sky was a certain shade of purple. Right? So just pause on that. Sky turns a certain shade of purple, car starts turning left with increasing frequency. Now, as a human being that the color of the sky should not, predicate the way that you turn, so this was really mystifying to its designers. And after engaging us, we discovered that they had done the training for this particular turning scenario in the Nevada desert when the color of the sky was this shade of purple, and that is the only time that they had done this training, right? So this is what we call a nonsensical correlation. It is a correlation in the data that the system has made that does not translate into common sense real life. And this illustrates a real challenge of these opaque systems, because if you don't know how they work, you don't know when they will fail. And if you don't know when they will fail, there are all these edge cases that are lurking in the system, waiting to be discovered with potentially disastrous consequences, right? So that is the problem. What is the solution? Well, there are many academic and commercial initiatives that have created explainability algorithms. And so these are algorithms that try to unwind these opaque systems and give you some hypothesis as to why they've reached the decisions they reach. So there are open source techniques like LIME, like SHAP. There are proprietary techniques from big tech and small tech. Our own contribution to this area is something called quantitative explainable AI, or quantitative explainability, where we will basically give you an explanation but then try to give you quantitative justification for the explanation that we are giving you, right? So in the top example here, you can see that we have a classification example. We are identifying this as a warplane, but we are highlighting the area of the image that the AI is looking at to make that diagnosis, and we are telling you that when it looks at those highlighted pixels, it is 99% certain that it's a warplane. Conversely, if we remove that from the input, you can see the prediction changes appreciably to 24% and actually thinks it's a parachute. And what we've discovered is that when we work with enterprises, this level of granularity is really key in understanding the innards of the artificial intelligence and how it's doing what it's doing. Now, let's get to the crux of this talk, and that is explainability at the edge, right? So most of us will have heard of artificial intelligence at the edge, which is where you get the AI executing at a location that is most relevant to the operation at hand. So think about executing in a GPU in an autonomous vehicle, a CPU in a satellite, an FPGA in a drone. It's working literally at the point that makes the most sense. It's not connected to a server. When we talk about explainability at the edge, we are talking about running the explainability algorithm itself at the point of inference, right? And the first thing to note about that is that that is a computationally much more expensive operation. Okay, depending on the algorithm you're using, it could be anywhere between 2 and 10x more expensive than actually just running the AI itself. So the question is, why on earth would we want to do such a thing? I'm going to give you 3 reasons in ascending order of novelty and coolness, okay? Now, the first reason is the most obvious and the most practical, and that is when you have a human in the loop that is involved in the system and interacting with the system, you might want to surface explanations to them in real time because they need to validate the AI in some important way, right? And one of the benefits of working a lot with enterprise customers is that we get to work in a variety of verticals. And just in the past year, here are some examples that we've encountered where explainability for the individual really makes sense. And so in the bottom left, this is a pharmaceutical company that's looking at FibroScan images to determine who is admitted to a clinical trial. And in this case, the operator is a nurse practitioner who is looking at what the AI is doing and kind of validating it. We have a lot of aerospace and industrial clients. One of their big responsibilities is actually maintaining vehicles for the government, military and non-military. And so this is something like corrosion analysis. These used to take hundreds of hours of manual labor before. Now they actually analyze it with handheld devices, but they need to get that real-time feedback to see why are you considering this corrosion versus rust, and why is this a dent, and so forth. And so that real-time feedback is really a necessity. And one of the areas that we've really double-clicked into significantly as an organization is manufacturing. In particular, using visual inspection for quality assurance. If you think about just what's going on in the world, global chip supply shortage, labor shortage, there really is a need for local manufacturers to bring efficiencies, in the country. And so in this case, we are surfacing to a factory worker or an operator why something is classified as imperfect or asymmetrical, and that feedback is really key, not only in diagnosing the error of the part itself, but actually diagnosing the actual workflow and the actual supply chain. So this is the most obvious reason. If we stop the talk here, it alone would justify why you need explainability at the edge. But there are two other reasons I want to give you. The second one is interesting. It's preserving the fidelity of the explanation itself, almost like the flight recording machine in an aircraft or a black box in an aircraft, to use black box in another context, right? So here I'm going to show you a YouTube clip of someone that literally just drove a self-driving Tesla around. And here you are seeing the autonomous vehicle encounter a construction worker holding a stop sign, something many of us would have encountered and intuitively known what to do. In this case, the car doesn't actually stop. The human operator has to override the car because the Tesla hasn't seen this before. Now think about a situation that was catastrophic. In this situation, we want to know canonically what happened at the point of disaster or at the point of error, right? And those of you that are technical will know you can never take something that occurred in the moment and replicate it with complete fidelity outside that situation. And so for diagnostic purposes, explainability at the edge will give you a canonical record of what was happening during this time. So that's the second reason. Now the third is actually my favorite, and it's the most profound and the most fun. And that is using explainability at the edge for monitoring, anomaly detection, and more. So what do I mean by this? Now I'm going to show you a very embarrassing video. This is a video that we created at Darwinai in 2018, back when we thought that this was polished, when we were just a budding startup. This is video taken at the outskirts of an industrial road in Toronto. And we were trying to illustrate the benefits of explainability for autonomous vehicles, right? So explainability, you're seeing the parts and the objects that would cause the car to go forward and backwards and turn. And now you're just looking at the explainability data itself. What if we took the explainability data itself and analyzed it in real time using artificial intelligence, right? So think about what's going on here. You in fact have three systems. You have the AI running in real time in the GPU in the vehicle. You have the explainability algorithm running in real time as well, giving you all this explainability context. And then you have a third system that is analyzing the explainability data to give you deeper insights and more profound understanding of what is happening. Right? You may be able to detect irregularities. You may be able to see what goes outside the standard deviation. You may be able to figure out what is confusing the artificial intelligence. Let me anchor this in a practical example. So a colleague of mine runs an autonomous flight company out in Europe. And about, I think it was 6 or 7 months ago, they did a test, just a regular test they do every day. And they didn't know that on that particular day, there was a lunar eclipse, right? So when the autonomous vehicles encountered this, they had never been trained for it before, and with predictable results, it didn't handle it well and they crashed. Think about what might happen if we had this third-level system, right? We would be able to do things like see there was an irregularity and focus in on that area and gather more data, and then maybe initiate some kind of emergency shutdown mechanism. So the benefits of this are quite enormous, and we term this, it's a new technology really, second-order explainability is the term we've given it and that we're working on. Those of you that remember your calculus from high school may recognize the delta here. We also sometimes call it derivative XAI because it's actually the change of rate of explainability itself, or XAI prime. Some of you may recognize this meme that went around the internet a few years ago, right? Which is, how do you combine information in an intuitive way? There's data, there's information, then there's knowledge and insight and wisdom. What I've described to you is conceptually straightforward, but the real challenge is, how do you deduce appropriate signals from that explainability data to do something intelligent? That's the challenge here, and that's the problem that we're working on at Darwinai. Now, lastly, I would contend that this technology, second-order XAI, is actually more profound and expansive than just applying it to explainability. I sometimes used to show this slide when I first started talking about deep learning 4 or 5 years ago, and it was basically, the higher problems or the unsolved problems of artificial intelligence, and it's dated. But you can see that as we approach, the latter part of the decade, there's quintessentially human concepts here: common sense reasoning, learning from reading, learning from doing. This takes on new meaning for me because I have a 3-year-old now who is starting to do these things, albeit with a lot of protest. So how does this relate to explainability? Well, scientists and social scientists, when they look at our unique capabilities as a species, they claim that what separates us from non-human animals is a fancy word they term metacognition, which is basically the awareness of our thought processes and an understanding of the patterns behind them. Right? It's a fancy way of saying not only can we think, but we can think about how we think. Right? We can create models of the world, and we can enact our participation in that world, but we can also analyze how we think about those models. And that one level removed from actual consciousness is what gives us a lot of human intelligence. It's what gives us mathematics. It's what gives us, the theory of relativity, or deep learning itself, right? I'm going to leave you with this tantalizing thought. Could we argue that second wave or second order explainability, made possible by explainability at the edge in real time, is in fact a precursor or the beginnings of metacognition for artificial intelligence? And if it is, what does that portend for some of the long-term goals that we've set for artificial intelligence and we'll explore during the rest of this conference? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sheldon. So fascinating. Yes, please join me here. We'll have some time for questions. Again, if you're in the room, you can raise your hand. And if you're in our virtual audience, you can submit your questions for Sheldon online. I have lots of them myself. The first question I wanted to start with, Sheldon, was, is there something about operating at the edge that makes explainability even more important? Or is it more specific to the application that you're trying to use it for? Self-driving cars, very high stakes. It's especially important in that area. Are there cases where it doesn't matter so much, or is it something that you believe should be integrated in every AI program moving forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't think it needs to be everywhere, right? If we think about mission-critical applications where having that rich context is useful, there's some that immediately come to mind. Like you can think of something, inside like, a warplane, for example. But if I'm looking at the recommendation system for a book or an album, maybe that isn't as necessary, right? So it really depends. I'm going to get some water here.
Sure.
It really depends on how much do you need that rich context in real time, right? Even the human examples I gave, probably some of those near real time would be good enough. But there are some, like, for example, on a battlefield, where you really do need that real time richness.
So that's very helpful. And as you said, explainable AI is very computationally complex, maybe more expensive in many cases. So really identifying those real-time needs is crucial to knowing when it'll actually pay off for you. I wanted to ask you about the graphic in your presentation where there's like a blurry version of explainable AI 2 years ago, and it's getting sharper and sharper, and you've obviously invested a lot into building a technology that you think is more explainable. Can you tell us a little bit about what advances have made this possible now today, the work that your company is doing in explaining AI and its decision making more clearly than possible a couple of years ago?
Yeah, so I mean, that graphic, which I did in Photoshop, I'm quite proud of my skills. It was meant to reflect that the concept is only crystallized recently. But we've had the theory, the underlying scholarship, for about 5 or 6 years. But what's changed is the amount of data we have access to, and moreover, the amount of production scenarios where we can apply it. Right? So in 2018, we were just trying to convince companies that this was an apparatus that could change their business, that it could actually be relevant to their business in some ways. Explainability was like item 20 out of 25. It was just getting data and getting it to production. In 2020 and 2021, we actually started deploying these systems, and that's where these questions really started becoming serious, and where we applied the scholarship in practical ways. And when you apply it in practical ways, that's when you see its shortcomings and its strengths and so forth. And so the sophistication is really just the market, I would say, catching up to the capabilities of deep learning, which in large part have been around for quite some time.
That makes sense. And I want to talk a bit about the shortcomings of this still today, and have a better sense or understand, how accurate this is, or how confident you are in saying, yes, we can explain many different kinds of decisions that the system is making. Talk a little bit more in detail about what that looks like and how often you're able to do that for a client versus where you still need to make some progress with your team.
A great question. So the thing to understand or appreciate is that all explainability algorithms are giving you a statistical guess of what they think the explanation is. Now, we published a pretty seminal paper at NeurIPS, the conference, a while back in 2019, I think it was, where we contrasted our approach with a number of others, and we relied on what's called a counterfactual approach, where we say, here's the explanation, let's take that explanation away from the data and see if the prediction changes appreciably. That's essentially, our guys did it in a much clever way. And that was to test the efficacy of these explainability algorithms. And for the most part, we were able to show the strengths and weaknesses of certain approaches like LIME or SHAP and our approach as well. And so they're giving you a statistical approximation of what they think, again, the explanation is. What you do with that information is what is key, right? Can you deduce meaningful observations from that statistical approach to make better data, or to better inform yourself about a decision that was being made that maybe would require human intervention? And one thing I would add to this is, I remember early in the days of Darwin, I tried a thought experiment, which I wouldn't recommend. I was at dinner with my wife, and she ordered salmon. And I asked, why did you order salmon? And she said, well, I felt like fish. And I said, yeah, but why'd you order salmon specifically? And I kept drilling down, and I almost ruined dinner, because eventually there's no explanation. I just felt like it. And so one thing to ask is, are we holding AI to a standard of explanatory behavior that we don't even hold human beings to? And what is the expectation of the explanation there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that helps a lot. I'm going to take a couple questions here from our online audience. Here's a question about product recommendations. So product recommendations, models, and financial services optimize for higher customer lifetime value. How can we make explainability and models such as that work for customers?
Yeah, that's a great question. Where explainability is quite powerful, especially in a financial context, is ensuring fairness for distribution across what we call protected classes, right? So you want to make sure that if a mortgage is recommended, or there's some credit score that's recommended, that certain variables are not considered in that recommendation. I'm thinking specifically of ethnicity and gender and age and so forth. And so explainability is often a useful tool to see the extent to which these systems are leveraging or depending on those protected classes. So I've seen it being used in fairness. I've also seen it being used in areas of robustness, like if certain fluctuations occur, do I still get the same recommendation maybe a year later? So that's particularly where we see it in financial services.
Another excellent question here from our online audience. There's tension between explainability and privacy risk within the context of model inferencing attacks. What are your thoughts on mitigation strategies, especially when we're talking about the edge?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very tough one. The question the theme that we also heard this morning was, how do you get the balance right between the amount of data that you need for these systems and the privacy that individuals can claim for their data? And I don't know if explainability gives us a solution to that. It might, for example, tell us whether or not anonymized data still contains the residue of somebody's personal information. That's one of the questions we sometimes grapple with. For example, if I have personal information in a data set and the model is trained on it, certain GDPR legislation says that I can ask for that data to be removed. And so, okay, you can remove my data from the data set, but if you don't retrain the model and it's benefited from my data that was trained against the model, to what extent is my personal information, quote unquote, in the model? There is some theoretical work being done to see if explainability can provide the hard answer to that question. And it's a really tricky one because your data is not in the model, but the residue of the data is. So is that a personal privacy question? It's an open question right now in terms of the legal understanding of it.
So who in the room has a question? Yes.
Yeah, René de Paula from São Paulo, Brazil. I would like to recommend to everybody, MIT has a very interesting channel, news.mit.edu. It's a very interesting blog. And a few days ago, they had a very interesting article about how the brain, at least the brain of mice, they have a special process, they're localized in some kind of specific area, a very similar process. So when you're trying to make a decision and the result is unexpected, it forces you to rethink your whole strategy. It's a natural thing in the brain. And since your company's name is Darwin, my question is, how convergent do you think that the evolution of AI is convergent to the way our own brains developed?
What a fantastic question. I don't know if I can answer it in 2 minutes. I mean, that to me is the ultimate question. My master's thesis, incidentally, 15 years ago, was on neuroscience and metaethics. And I was asking the question, can anything about the latest advances in brain science tell us anything about our foundational morality, like how we devise answers of right and wrong? And the conclusion, and this was in 2007, 2008, was that the brain is so phenomenally complex that the best we can do is just weak correlation. We can tell you, like, this part of the brain we think is involved in moral computation. Now, will it converge? I think this is your question. Will we have a convergence between the complexity of neural networks and the complexity of the brain? I mean, that's the ultimate question. And I often say, like, I don't know if we're going to get the answer in my lifetime, but given the progress, I think we might get it in my son's lifetime.
That would be a fascinating topic for an entire EmTech Digital.
Indeed.
Yes, another question from the audience. Who have we got? Yes.
Hi, Javier Viaña from MIT. I wonder if, in order to get true explainable human-level AI, right, would you say that deep learning requires fundamental change?
Good question. I guess the question I would put back at you is what level of explainability would satisfy us from a human point of view, right? We work with a lot of industries, and the fascinating thing is that the explanation I need to give the human operator will change depending on their vertical, right? If they're a stock trader that's working with a real-time system, what they expect in terms of explainability and the nomenclature they use and the context I give them is very different from what I'm giving somebody at an aerospace company. So perhaps, but I think the first thing we need to do is agree on what a sufficient level of explanation would be in human terms, and then look at how we might augment deep learning as an apparatus to meet those conditions. I think that's the best answer I can give you, given the ambiguity around it, to be honest.
Yes, take another one from the room here.
Hi. I like your approach. Actually, I do have the similar type of approach for healthcare.
Okay.
I want your opinion about the healthcare, because if you look at any hospital, each unit, they do have different type of domain. They don't talk to each other. They write gibberish language in their charts. But my thought was putting at every unit different type of edge, and they do, before it goes to EHR, they do analytics and AI, then send it to EHR. What is your thought about it?
So I'll preface this by saying my wife's a psychiatrist, so I need to be careful how I comment on professional healthcare matters. I think actually, if you look at advanced natural language processing and so forth, there is a lot of promise there. When I look at the systems, that she uses, for example, they are so antiquated, and mental health. I mean, it's a huge issue, especially during the pandemic. And I look at the inefficiencies of the system, and I look at basic things that AI could improve. Like, for example, after a session, my wife spends, I think, 3 or 4 hours writing a note, and I think we must be able to get you a system that can do this in minutes. So could you implement AI at the edge to harmonize this? Yes. I don't think the challenge is technological, right? The technology's there. The challenge is harmonizing all these different elements of the hospital or what have you that have different standards and elements. Like, it's almost a human problem. And we see this at an enterprise level all the time. The technology is like 10% of the problem, right? It's getting the organizational buy-in, it's getting data, it's getting agreement, it's addressing the privacy question. That's going to be your challenge, not the implementation at the edge. That's a good start, but it's all the surrounding infrastructure you're going to have to get in place to make it a success. But I think you should try, definitely.
I want to broaden that question out to other industries as well, because you are working on implementing explainable AI and quality control programs across many different industries. But you have to match what you've created with the reality on the ground. We kind of touched on this in our earlier session, but it can be quite messy in terms of the hardware that you've got to deal with, the manufacturing equipment, and making that work all with the processes a company already has in place. So how do you, where do you often find that what's most challenging about that stage, and how do you kind of work through that with your team to actually get your clients something that they can use?
Yeah, it's a great question. So like as mentioned, we deal primarily right now with manufacturing clients who are looking to really make manufacturing processes extremely efficient. And it's a simple problem. Like, deep learning excels at looking at vast amounts of data and finding irregularities in that data. Manufacturing quality inspection is a perfect candidate for that. The technology, it's not trivial. I mean, there are, one of the challenges we find is the minute you move something in a contrived POC setting to another area of the factory where the lighting is different or the environmental factors are different, it often breaks down. So we've spent a lot of time creating robust or adaptive AI that works across those conditions. But it's the challenges around the AI, right? So for example, in manufacturing, the imaging system that actually captures the images needs to be aware of the angles and so forth that AI expects. So we've actually had to invest a lot of time in the hardware expertise to get that hardware set up and have the AI guys talking to the hardware guys to make sure that the two systems are in sync. And once you do that, then you're connecting to a broader enterprise system where all the data lies. And so most AI companies, including us, it's no longer sufficient just to be good at AI, is what I'm finding. You need to be good at other enterprise skill sets to really serve your client appropriately. And so we've had to build that expertise in-house. And I'd say now 40 or 50% of my company certainly is AI. The other part are enterprise software engineers that need to bring these systems to life, and that's far from trivial.
And one more question from the floor.
Hi, I'm Raghav. I'm from SAP on the same manufacturing and supply chain products.
We talk to your system, so I'm going to talk to you.
So one question we have is, you talked about mission critical applications for companies, and supply chain is mission critical. And explainable supply chain is very important. So we introduced a very simple thing like K-means to come up with what should be the top A, B, C products. Okay. And customers wouldn't do it and wouldn't trust it. Okay. Because that could lead to millions of dollars of inventory just sitting on the shelf if they don't get it correct. So explainable AI is very important. So even as small as K-means, we have adoption problems.
Right.
So how do you see this industry of explainable AI?
Yeah, it's a good point. And one of the points I forgot to mention is when it comes to explainability, sometimes it's just giving the human operator the psychological comfort of knowing what is happening so they are a partner in the AI decision-making process, right? So if it's just giving you an answer without context, you're asking the human being to trust the AI without that context. And oftentimes, by providing that context, you make them an instrument in executing the AI correctly. And so oftentimes we've seen the explainable element of the AI just give them that peace of mind so that they know it's doing the right things for the right reasons. I didn't mention this, I didn't have time, but in the early days of COVID, we actually used explainable AI to create a neural network called COVIDNet that diagnosed corona based on chest x-rays and CT scans. MIT Tech was one of the first publications to cover it. And in the early days, it would diagnose corona just to see if somebody was lying on a hospital bed, like literally the divot, because it reasoned that if somebody was lying in a hospital bed, most likely they were sick. And that's when the human experts said, that doesn't make sense, and we had to scrub the data. And then after, they'd look at the lungs, and they would be able to marry that with their own expertise. So it's also psychological, and you raise an important point. Just giving people that ease of mind, okay, this is why it's doing this, will often get some of the buy-in, I think, that you're seeing some resistance to. Yeah, good question.
I want to end with a question from our virtual audience on the topic of metacognition. That was such an interesting one that you raised in your presentation. An audience member wants to know if you see the rise of hybrid models such as neurosymbolic networks as an important development in explainable AI, and whether Darwin AI is investigating such approaches.
So definitely yes, it is an important apparatus when it comes to explainable AI. I don't know how much theoretical work we've done on this topic in particular. We have our academics who are both workers at Darwinai and professors. They may have done on the theoretical side, but we have yet to introduce that into our kind of production grade tool set.
Excellent. Well, it's certainly a provocative vision, and we look forward to hearing more on that. That's all we have time for today, but thank you so much, Sheldon, for joining us.
Thank you.